We're delighted that Luke agreed to, as he told me this morning, for the first time, come over to Aotearoa. Luke is a Gamilaroi man and is founder and chief executive officer of IndigenousX. Some of you in the audience have published through IndigenousX, I've noticed, over the last couple of years, and in particular around health and medical education over the last few months. You can read more about his bio in the program, but briefly he's worked in a whole range of contexts, and there might be different reasons for why he's moved from one to the other. His passion for IndigenousX, and those of you that don't know it very well, look it up on the Guardian website in terms of the articles. It stems from his belief in the need to improve Indigenous media representation in Australia and to have a platform on which individuals can tell their own stories in their own words, so that we're not talked about necessarily by others, but Luke can talk more about that. The structure of Luke's session is that he'll talk for as long as he wants to, and then there's some questions already pre-planned from our participants, but it will then be open for a bit of a conversation before morning tea at 10 o'clock. Can you please join me in welcoming Mr. Luke Pearson?
Cheers, mate. These lights are bright, aren't they? All right. Good morning, everyone. Obviously, I'd like to thank the owners of this land for the beautiful welcomes we have. This, as mentioned, my first time over here. Absolute thrill and feel very honoured and privileged to be invited to talk to you all today. As mentioned, I don't work in health, or specifically Indigenous health. So they told me I was coming over to talk to a bunch of Indigenous doctors and health workers, and I thought, great, I can talk about this pain in my shoulder that I was told I should probably just go to my GP for that one, so fine. I'll introduce a bit about myself. As mentioned, I founded IndigenousX, which is shorthand for Indigenous Excellence. We started on Twitter about 8 years ago. We've moved off into running our own website, publishing our own articles, entirely self-funded, so we get no government support or organisational support. So we run a consultancy business, training, speaking, anything that pays the bills that I can do to keep doing what I love, which is working with other mob to give them an opportunity to tell their stories in their own words. And the last 8 years has been absolutely phenomenal. It's been, apart from my children and my wife, has been the greatest blessing in my life to have the responsibility I have of being the guardian, being the protector of that IndigenousX space and keeping it going. Normally I talk at the end of an event, not the start, so I thought we might have to do a bit of a warm-up, wake-up activity for everyone since I'm first cab off the rank. So what I want everyone to do, and there's a bit of a metaphor with this one because I like metaphors. I want everyone to put their hand out like this. This is where we are right now. This is where we're trying to go. But there's no shortcuts in where we're trying to go, so you're not allowed to roll your wrist. Take that one off the table. How do we get from here to here without rolling your wrist? Doing it the long way, that's still rolling. I see you, my mum. That's just a long roll. That's still a roll. See some people, everyone doing that one? I didn't say end up here, I said end up here. We've got to... No standing on your head, that's not necessary. I won't ask that of you. No. Good one, I like that. That's good. That's a clever one, but no. Oh, someone, oh no. I thought we had a hand up for someone to have it, but they're sitting there trying to work it out. Okay, do it with me, everyone. All right, we go here. Now, you think about it, you look at all your options, like, that's not going to help. This way, that feels good, that's natural. When you're here, you can't go that way, so you've got to go that way. Then you go that way, up, and down, and we get where we're going. And one of the benefits of my background as a primary school teacher is I know I know a lot of those sort of activities. But I like this. There's the metaphor I was talking about, one of, always introduce that activity is, we know where we are, we know where we're going to get, but it feels like the opposite of where we are a lot of the time. And we get stuck, we overthink, how do we get... But when you take out everything that doesn't work and you follow through that natural motion, you let your body do what it's meant to do, and you have faith in that journey, and you get where you want. A young fella, because I love that our young ones are coming up and they're just so staunch, and I was like, why can't I do it that way? That's easy, let's just do that. And they're actually right. Because a lot of what we want to do, a lot of what we know needs to be done, we could just do. But the systems that we work in, the broader, colonial societies that we live within, they go, no, you can't do that one. You got to follow the rules. But even following the rules, we can still get there. We just got to follow on that journey. And with IndigenousX, one of the greatest things when we have international Indigenous mobs is there is actually an IndigenousX Canada as well there on Twitter as IndigenousX CA for Canada. So hopefully if I do well enough, we'll end up with an IndigenousX NZ at the end of it. Anyone keen? Let me know. And that came about because we were on Twitter doing our thing and loving it, and a couple of women in Canada, Chelsea Vow particularly, reached out and she's like, oh, I like that. We wouldn't mind doing something like that. Can you give us a bit of a hand, how do you work it out? And I was like, you can just have everything, call it IndigenousX CA, and it's yours, and you go run it. Because even though we are a business and I did have to trademark it and protect it and do all those things, I'm not going to run Canada's one. That mob, they know what they're dealing with, they can run that one. We have that growing family that comes about. And when we started with IndigenousX, now it's actually a really great time in Indigenous media. There's still just breathtaking amounts of ignorance and racism in the media. We have a really, particularly in Australia, I'm not particularly, I'm sure it's the same for you as well everywhere else. But it was really, there were no spaces in Indigenous media for Indigenous commentary, Indigenous opinion. When we started 8 years ago, the only opinion pieces you'd read from Indigenous people were in The Australian of all places. And it would be from Noel, Marcia and Warren, and not to say they shouldn't be able to write opinion pieces, but we all can write opinion pieces, we all have opinions, we all have stories. And that's where one of our sort of principal ideas is that none of us may have all the answers, but we all have a story to tell. And those stories added up, that is the answer. That is what we need. There's a power that comes from being able to tell your own story in your own words. And there's insights that it offers for other mob, and particularly for non-Indigenous people as well, to break down that idea that we're all one group, that we all think the same, that we have this pan-Indigenous identity. I teach intro to Aboriginal studies at uni. I've done a lot of anti-racism work, and it always amazes me, that starting point of people going like, well, we have no idea, we weren't taught about it in school, we don't see it out there. And it's like, yeah, but you live in the age of Google, you could have Googled it. It's not that hard. We have been working actually really hard for the last many decades now, trying to get our stories out, trying to correct that misinformation. But what I find really interesting about doing Indigenous studies for people is, white fellas come to do Aboriginal studies and can even go and get a PhD in it. So I think every Indigenous person could just straight up be given an honorary doctorate in white people studies, because we have to know that. Because if we don't know that, we can't survive, quite literally, and we can't thrive within these spaces. So people come to learn Aboriginal studies and they come with these sort of ideas in their head. They want to learn corroboree and they want to, what's the Aboriginal word for this? And those sort of questions where it's like, not only can I not just answer the question, I've got to explain what's wrong with the question and then work you backwards from there, because for them fellas, if they don't know themselves, how can they possibly understand us? And that's where it becomes so important. We talk about Indigenous health, we talk about Indigenous education as opposed to education, as opposed to health. It's like, but they need an adjective too. They need white as that adjective. And it's amazing nowadays, there's a lot of what we're now starting to call white fragility around the word white. We're not allowed to say white. That's upsetting to white people to say white. Apparently I don't. It's like, you did that. We didn't, like, that's not, we didn't make the white only signs. We didn't make the white Australia policy. We didn't, you know, so if we're going to work back on that stuff, we've got to be able to talk about it. We've got to be able to understand it. And just as the same as when we say, you know, Aboriginal peoples have the worst health outcomes in Australia, which is true. That doesn't mean every single individual. That is a collective truth that we're working with. And so when we say white Australia is a white supremacist country, we're not saying every white person. We're saying that's just the reality. That's that history, that's where we're at, that's where we come from. And what else would it be? Again, when you have a country that is founded very overtly on the principles of white supremacy, that builds laws and institutions to reinforce and assert white supremacy, you get a white supremacist country. It's funny how that... it's not even as tricky as that one. It's just like... it's that one. But yeah, one of the first activities we do is we go like, when I say the phrase white supremacy, what does that mean to you? And there's always two answers. It means Nazis, and it means the KKK. Sometimes you get skinheads thrown in there too. Apologies to all our bald brothers out there. Unfair stereotype of people without hair. But that's how we've reframed what it is, what white supremacy is. That's that sort of pop culture media representation. Whiteness has removed itself from that concept and put itself... I loved that quote yesterday, which I don't remember exactly, so I'll horribly ruin it. But you know, when you got one side talking about indigenous rights and the other side thinking it's that act of charity, that act of benevolence, we're not on the same page. We're having very different conversations. And so, you know, it was not long ago where being overtly white supremacist was a normal thing to do. So nowadays, like, oh God, no, I'm not racist. No, not at all. You'd be like, hell yeah, super racist, it's great. And that was the norm, that was the conversation, that was the framework. Our very first Prime Minister, who most people don't know anything about or even know the name of, Edmund Barton. He's got that quote where he's like, I don't think, and again, I don't remember the quote, I suck at quotes, I'll just give I'll give the gist of it. But he's just going like, I don't think anyone needs convincing of the fact of white superiority. The other races are in fact inferior, and that's how that is. And that's how it went. But you look at it today, it's still pretty important for a political career that you put out an anti-refugee, anti-immigration, anti-indigenous. Even if you might use those nice words sometimes, being against those issues is a pretty strong guarantee. It's kind of essential to political success. And so that fear that we have in these Western countries of the idea that being called racist is like the worst thing that can possibly happen, so then you can literally become Prime Minister off the back of that, like as your dominant skill set. Like, you can get a TV show, you can get a newspaper column, you can do very well in life. Whereas when it comes to anti-racism, that's a hard job. Like, that's like, it's like everyone used to want cultural awareness training. And I hated calling it that, so I would call it anti-racism training. And work was few and far between. And so now I call it professional development training. That's because a lot of the time what we're talking about, it's like that, again, God, I'm just ruining quotes all day today. But that Martin Luther King quote where he's like, I know the law cannot make another man love me, but it can stop him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important too. And so in what we're trying to do with our non-Indigenous teachers, doctors, everyone, we're trying to give them this baseline understanding. We want them to understand it. We want them to be competent within it. We want them to get it. We want them to be a part of that journey with us. And that's important. That is definitely the goal. But what I'd also love to see is it's a professional requirement to not be racist, to be culturally competent, and if you aren't, then you can't do the job. And we haven't quite got to that point. That's a a bridge too far at the moment. That's that one. That's what that one looks like. Because again, we don't have a shared language. What's up there? Everyone's looking up there. Oh, that's me. It's a great website. I recommend it. We have a Patreon. I think there's a link up there somewhere. We have such a different understanding in that common language of when we talk about racism, when we talk about anti-racism. And we'll say a lot of people have that attitude of like, I don't like racism, I'm not racist, I hate racism. It's like, well, that's great, you know, like, I hate cancer. I wouldn't really know it if I was looking at it. I don't know what to do about it, but I hate it. And that's the same with anti-racism. It's not a value, it's a skill set. You need to be able to identify it, you need to know how to respond to it, and we need to ensure that our systems are built in a way that responds appropriately to it. And so moving the conversation out of values and good intentions and goodwill and a reflection on that individual, and just to say, no, like if you grew up a non-Indigenous person, particularly a white person, we say non-Indigenous to mean white. I've got to stop that because I'm not talking about a lot of those other non-white, non-Indigenous Australians. I'm really talking about white Australia. If you grew up in that environment, unless you've had something really significant happen, unless you've gone through a process of education and engagement and personal reflection, odds are you're going to come out with some serious racist attitudes, some stereotypical thinking. And again, it's not a huge attack on an individual. It's the same as like, if you go in the water, you'll probably come out wet. And that's racism in Australia. We had an aggressively overt racist education system, media system, political system, and we grow up just soaking up the world around us. So if that's the world that you've soaked up, then that's what it leads to. And so, you know, how we take the sting out of that word, I don't know. A lot of people have that, you know, like if you want to talk about racism, you can't talk about racism. It's like, that seems counterproductive. I don't know. If you want to talk about, you know, white fragility, white privilege, white supremacy, you can't use the word white. It's like, that makes it hard. Like that's all of these processes of where I think like, let's just go that way. let's just confront people with, let's just have those conversations. The same way that we talk about Indigenous, we need to be able to have those conversations about whiteness and where it comes from and where it reflects to, because even though, you know, colonisation, racism, like it adapts over time, it applies it learns from every lesson it's ever learned over, you know, 500-600 years. But it amazes me, the first time I started reading about Indigenous Canadian history, you know, you can be on page 3 or 4 before you realise it's not Australia. And then you're like, oh, yeah, no, okay. It's like, when did we start saying residential schools? That's not our, we have missions and reserve schools. It's like, it's the same bloody thing. It's the same process. And so whatever systems we're putting in place around that, I said it learns every lesson and it comes back bigger and better than before. Whereas we're still now just starting to learn from each other's lessons, starting to learn from that history. And sadly for a lot of our young ones today, they don't know that political history, they don't know that resistance history, they don't know that frontiers wars history. But geez, they learn it quick because they understand the principles in place with it. They know the feeling of it. As I always like when I'm talking to a room that's sort of, you know, half Indigenous, half white fellas, and black fellas are sitting there nodding, going, and the white fellas look at that puppy dog look, and the only way I can, it's like, just look to your left and right and see them mob nodding, and you'll know what I'm saying. Isn't that crazy? It isn't that out there on the fringe. But that's where, yeah, an amazing difference, you know, today is, you know, my father would have got shot for saying the things that I'm saying up on a stage, and I get invited on stages to say them, only sometimes. But that's an amazing difference. That's, you know, we're having these conversations now about police in Victoria and about white supremacy within the police force. And people are like, no, but police are they're the good guys. We go to them for help. That's what they are. And it's like, that's not my upbringing in that environment. And my stories were about, the days of vagrancy laws, where if you're in a town and you didn't have $10 to your name, they'd lock you up overnight and kick you out the next day, which was largely used against Aboriginal people. And Dad had them stories of, every time he got to a town, he had to go into the nearest pub and say, I'll fight any man here for $10, win or lose, just give me the $10 so I don't get locked up. And so better to get beat up than locked up and be put in the hands of those police. He had stories of, getting driven out of town for doing that and literally got shot and left out of town. And that's a generation ago. Like, that was my understanding of the police growing up. So when we're having conversations about racism in the police force, I'm like, you're a bit late, but welcome to the conversation. But having these opportunities to get these stories across and normalising them, and not having to be the only fella up there, not having to stick your neck out, but coming out with that collective strength. And that's something I really love about IndigenousX, is no one has to have the pressure of being the spokesperson for all Indigenous people. You can just be a Indigenous person, an Indigenous person, grammar. And you can tell that story safe in the knowledge that you don't have the burden of responsibility of representing every person. And we've all had that conversation where you'll say something and go, well, I had another Aboriginal person who told me something else, so I don't know what to do. Like, my mind is just exploding now with the, which one of you are right? And it's like, we can have different opinions, we can have different experiences, we can have different perspectives, and that's not a threat, that's not a challenge, that's common sense. That's something that, the fact that we've got to cover that ground in our cultural awareness, cultural competency, whatever we want to call it, is breathtaking. Yes, we are people who have thoughts and experiences. That's my only. That's the feeling for those of us who have to deal with that on a daily. Even the founding of IndigenousX. When I started, I was on Twitter in the early days when it was brand new, and it was an amazing platform because you could just say things. I'd already been fired from the public service. I didn't have to worry about losing my job. It was great. I could just sort of unload. And people started to listen and to respond, and we're building a community and we're building a platform, and media started reaching out to me and asking me for my opinion on things, and I'm like, how gratifying. People are really interested in what I want to hear, and for the first couple of years it was just amazing. It was just a really beautiful time where I really felt I'd found a space, not just, with Mob out behind the bike shed having a smoke at the end of the meeting talking about real talk. You actually had a space where I could talk about real talk in the open. And then one day I got a media request to give my opinion on Indigenous women's experiences in the Northern Territory of living on the Basics card. And I thought, maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. Maybe these white journos are just freaking lazy and don't actually know any Aboriginal people, and I'm generally willing to speak, so they're all just coming to me. And that was very deflating. That was really heartbreaking. But in that moment, in that crisis, came the revelation of what I should do with my Twitter account. So it was my personal account. I changed the name of it to IndigenousX. I said we're going to have a different Indigenous person each week, because I had this platform and it was an amazing platform. I didn't want to just go, and walk away from it all. I was like, this is too good. There's too much opportunity in this, but I can't just have it for myself. And when it started off, the first sort of level of media that would come and want to talk about it, you could see in their eyes when they were doing it, it's like they had this like primitive 65,000 years meets future technology. This is a great story, and I'm like, that's not the story. Don't tell that story. But from an Indigenous perspective, I had something that was powerful, that was more than I needed, so I shared it with my mob. That isn't an innovative, revolutionary idea. That's a core principle of Indigenous philosophies, of Indigenous ways of being. And that's what I did. No idea how long it would go. There weren't that many of us on Twitter back in the day, so I was like, we'll probably just go for like 2 or 3 months and then just have to rotate between us. But it grew and it expanded, and more mob started to come to Twitter, and we have this place, this safe, culturally responsible space that anyone can engage, any Indigenous person can come and host without having to be framed as an Indigenous leader or as an Indigenous activist. They're generally, before something like IndigenousX, that's how everyone will get referred to, and you still see those. Sorry, everyone looking above my head. We still see those stories now, but we have a platform. So, recently, at the start of the year, this is quite an Australian example, so apologies for anyone who doesn't get the references, but when we have those breakfast TV horrible things, and we have horrible people on them, and one of those horrible people, Kerry-Ann Kennelly, got up and said some horrible things. And the next day in The Australian, there was an article, Indigenous leaders support Kerry-Ann. And it was Ken Wyatt and Jacinta and Warren. They're all in the Liberal Party. They're all so Indigenous leaders is a broad term. And it's not that I disagree with them, that is a problem with them being called Indigenous leaders. It's that we're not a homogenous group that have a centralised leadership base that you can put up anyone and say, this is an Indigenous leader. You might have a community leader, you might have an organisational leader, you might have a law leader within ceremonial businesses, our bosses. But you can't say someone is an Indigenous leader. But because the understanding of Indigenous peoples is so limited, you can say that and get away with that. But now we have a platform where the next day I wrote an article said, white leaders oppose Kerry-Ann Kennelly. And I picked out 3 random white people that I liked. And I took their quotes horribly out of context and I misrepresented what they were saying. And I put out my article out. And purely for the purpose of holding that mirror back up to just go these things don't make sense. And you should know that. You don't need a degree. You don't need to explain that. Even when people are like, oh, but you're fair skinned, you've got blue eyes, how can you be Aboriginal? How does that work? It's man, we're not new. We've been, roughly 9 months after you fellas turned up, fellas like me started to turn up too. You should know that. We're not new, this isn't new. And to stop and to have these conversations at this level, it slows us down from having those bigger conversations. At the moment, we're having these conversations about a voice to Parliament, and for it or against it doesn't matter. It's the way that it's being talked about and the way that it's being responded to. And there was a really interesting quote that came out, comment that came out recently, said, well, if you do that, you're always framing Indigenous people as being disadvantaged. As in, the only point of having Indigenous voices is to address Indigenous disadvantage. And it's even if the history had gone the other way, we are still the sovereign peoples of our land. We are still the Indigenous peoples of this land. Oh, Indigenous people, you just want special treatment. It's well, it is special to be Indigenous. We are the Indigenous peoples of this land. This is our land. We have a right to have a say, and we should not feel ashamed or embarrassed by that. It's just when you put that tone in it, oh, you want special treatment. That's when it sounds a bit, it's no, it is special. We are special. We have solutions not just towards Indigenous issues, but to global problems. And we need opportunities to get them out. And even when no one's listening, it's still important to say that, even though it can be very difficult to express our sovereignty because of the systems that are in place on top of us, it does not mean it does not exist. And keeping core to that truth, keeping core to that philosophy, refusing to go along with the narratives that are imposed on top of us and cutting through them in all the different ways. People go, what's the solution to... And I was man, if we had the one solution that was that simple, we would have solved it and it wouldn't be a problem by now. So we've all got to be coming at it from different ways. Whether you can use comedy, whether you can use research, whether you can use people attaining those new higher positions and helping other mob come up instead of, building those walls higher when they get there. All of those things are important. But for a lot of mob out there, they're just trying to survive and live their lives. And that's, a lot of the stuff I do and the way I like to think of it is I'm trying to have these conversations, I'm trying to affect these changes so that other mob can just live, can just get about their life without... It was like when my daughter came along, we had an Indigenous midwives program at the hospital near where I was at, and I was talking to a friend about it, and he's like, so what's that? Like, why do you need that? And it's like, the simple reason, the cultural side of what we do around pregnancy and birth, like, we've got that, we're good. But what I need when I go with my pregnant wife to talk about our daughter coming into the world is not to have to answer stupid racist questions. That's all I need, that's all. But the confidence that I could get that meant the world. It meant the absolute world to us to be able to have that. And more than that, there is more than that. It's that connection, it's to be able to, in that first call, work out, which one of us is her cousin that she's coming in to talk to, and having those shared histories and that shared understanding that the words we use, she understands and uses those words in the same way. The experiences we talk about aren't crazy or aren't taking things out, but that's part of our lived experience, and we can just talk freely about them instead of having to code shift and talk about things in a certain way so that we can make sure that we get adequate services appropriately in the same way that other people take for granted. That is absolutely priceless. But having to instill those skills, like it's so frustrating that they're the first sort of things we have to work with our kids on. And as parents, having that conversation of like, so what age do you think is appropriate to tell your kids that the world kind of hates them? That's a freaking rough conversation to have. You know what I mean? Like, but they're real conversations. Like we had our young fella coming home telling stories, and we're like, he's starting to work it out. We should probably just let him know that unfortunately, there are people you're going to encounter where that's how that's going to be. And people who should care for you, your teacher, a police officer, a complete random down the street, that's a reality that I really don't want for my children. But I also would feel negligent as a parent if I didn't prepare them for the world that they're walking into. And so we talk about, in education, I don't know how about in health, but we talk a lot about resilience training for Aboriginal kids. It's like, that is important. Unfortunately, that is important. What we don't talk about, though, that I think is just as important, is anti-racism training for white kids so that my kids don't need to be as resilient. That can't be the solution indefinitely. We've fixed it. We give blackfellas tougher skin and teach them how to deal with all this horrible stuff that we know we're going to lump on their shoulders. Problem solved. We're done. What's next? We've got to be working towards that point where saying these things aren't revolutionary, aren't controversial, aren't problematic. Because, as Auntie Rosalie on Q&A, for those who remember, we are not the problem. We are the solutions. The problems came over on boats a long time ago, and we're still trying to work with them. But we have the solutions, and we could just bang, that quick. But you would need to have rules in place, and you would need to enforce them. And so instead, we're stuck in these positions still of convincing people to do the right thing because it's the right thing, rather than saying, if you do the wrong thing, there will be consequences. Because we know that racism kills. As health professionals, you've done research on that. Like, you know that. We're the most over-researched groups on the planet as Indigenous peoples. We have the research to back that up, that we know racism kills. Yet, in any professional setting, but they didn't mean it. It's like, well, in legal frameworks, when you didn't mean to kill someone, that's involuntary manslaughter. There's still consequences. It's not as bad as manslaughter or murder, but it's still not a good thing, and that's generally understood. We don't have that. We don't have these responses to it. And I'm not necessarily saying we should lock racists up. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying there needs to be more than what we're doing now. Because in any professional context, it is more dangerous to your career, to your well-being, to be the recipient of racism and to call it out for what it is, than it is to be racist in a professional setting. That is a reality. And so these fears that are ingrained within the national psyche of our respective countries are so bewildering to me. You know, my wife, she's darker, our daughter's lighter, and when she's out in public with them, white women, particularly older white women, look at her like she might be stealing this little white baby. Like they do, they're worried for my daughter's health and well-being. They look like, what's this? It's like, well, actually in Australia, we don't have a history of black women stealing white kids. If you read a history book, you'll see that's really not where the issue comes from. And we've got a darker son, and yet when I'm out with him, people are like, oh, isn't he a good dad, isn't he? Good on you, mate. Just out with me, son, on the shop, and I don't think I need a round of applause. But similarly, my wife doesn't need that intimidation, that concern, that animosity that comes with existing. We don't need, you know, when we're out as a family and someone behind the counter go, so how's all that work? And there's a million ways that could work. None of them are your business. Please just, you know, tell me how much the milk costs and I'll pay for it and go about my day. Like, but even that level of thing, oh no, you should, like, I'm interested. I want to know about your culture. Please teach me. It's like, again, I'm just out doing the shopping. Like, I'm not, like, there are courses for that, or Google it. Again, you can work that out on your own time. It's not a gift that you give to me to have interest and expect me to provide the intellectual and emotional labour to explain to you why I exist and how I exist and about my culture and about my history. Like, that's not, but they're the behaviours that we're, again, even still at these starting points of what people think are acts of charity are actually extra work for us. And that's an amazing mindset, that's an amazing psyche, that, like, how do we distill that? How do we unpack that? And the way we do it, again, in that simple process, is to say no. We're not doing that. To have that as part of professional development. Not as a one-day cultural awareness training, not as 1 hour in the curriculum. I teach Aboriginal education at our university. And in education we have, it's a responsibility of teachers and schools, backed up by policy, to embed Aboriginal perspectives in every key learning area. That's maths, that's English, that's science, that's health, PE, whatever, everyone. And yet at a university level, I get these student teachers in third year and I say, okay, so what do you know? We know nothing at all, we know absolutely nothing. And then when you get them to write down what they think they know, it's usually pretty horrific. And so the university, in their efforts to help prepare teachers to be able to embed Aboriginal perspectives in every key learning area, don't embed it in any key learning area and give me 6 months within a very busy degree to teach history, policy, racism, every key learning area a year before they're out teaching. And then once they're out there, if they're lucky, they'll have strong community, they'll have an AEA, Aboriginal education workers, officers, Aboriginal community liaison officer who might be able to give them support, but those people are amazingly overloaded and overworked as well. And so when the systems that we're embedding to achieve the outcomes clearly don't align, well then there's only 2 real options with how me as a professional examining that can say, well, either you're grossly incompetent or you're not really trying to achieve the outcome that you say you're trying to achieve. And a big way that we can try and interpret that is go, well, what's the accountability framework for failure in failing to achieve the outcome of the policy that you wrote? Nothing. Or very limited. In New South Wales education, the best anti-racism policy you could ever imagine. It's like, we will weed out direct and indirect racism at staff, community, students, like all forms of racism. We will. So, okay, so what's the implementation of the anti-racism policy? If someone notes an instance of racism, puts their hand up and say, this is racism, there's an anti-racism officer who's had 1 day of training, who will make a determination on whether or not it's racist. It's like, well, that doesn't do much for direct racism, but it certainly does nothing for indirect racism. So your processes do not match your stated policy outcomes. So again, are you grossly and professionally incompetent, or are you not really trying to achieve the outcome that your policy states? And that's where I think so much of it comes back to racism and anti-racism is all the policies in the world, all the goodwill in the world. For us, in Australia, like we're the ones without the treaty. And we're sitting there going like, will the treaty with the mob we've got running the show at the moment actually get us any outcomes? Because they don't really seem to want to help. Because as much as, I've grown up with treaty, like we got that as a song, that's an anthem, that's instilled in my DNA that I want a treaty. But at the same time, it's like, I don't have a treaty with anyone sitting at the table here, and I'm not going to kill you or steal from you or take. You can do the right thing. If we're already doing the right thing, then I go, oh cool, let's lock this down and let's get a contract that says we'll keep doing the right thing. And we'll try and protect that for future generations. But we're living in an environment where it's very much not the right thing that is going on. At policy level, at practical level, at implementation level, at a community level, at a media level. And so I don't think I want to make a treaty with that mob. And I hate to say that because I really want a treaty. Like, it's really like, I don't know what else to say about that. But there's got to be a point in the conversation where it's, let's get on with doing the right thing in the right way. And I don't want to have these conversations indefinitely. I want to, I think again for me, watching my father, the way that he had to respond to authority, that there is an innate joy that comes from my ability to speak truth to power. I generally don't do it as much if I get pulled over by the police, but in spaces like this, I can do that with a level of safety and confidence. But we all need to be able to do that. We need to be able to do that collectively. We need to be able to assert common sense principles. Speak our truth. Again, within that self-determination principle, it includes the right to make mistakes, to sometimes say the wrong thing, and not be judged too harshly for that either. Because again, with our government systems, like they get to make mistakes. We had the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Commission, ATSIC. When the government got rid of that, they said this was the failed experiment of Aboriginal self-determination. We gave them a chance. They ruined it. Now we've got to take it away from them. When's the failed experiment of democracy? When's the failed experiment of our government systems? Like, we need the ability to exercise our self-determination and explore new pathways, to search for new solutions, to not instantly go, we can solve it all while following your policies and processes which were actually, in fact, built explicitly to keep us out of the systems and to not allow us to change them. We need the ability to not talk about reconciliation in terms of our relationship with non-Indigenous people, but opportunities to talk about our relationship amongst ourselves as Indigenous people, to have social and cultural and economic opportunities and to exercise those, to exercise our status amongst ourselves and our relationship to the colony. They are the core principles of self-determination in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Again, even though we might not be able to exercise those rights, we cannot forget that they are our rights. And I see a line up the front here, so I'm guessing that's my wind-up. But thanks you, Bob. I've really enjoyed it. We're going to have some Q&A, but thank you so much for having me here again. It's a true honour to be here.
I get a sense that Luke's actually just warming up.
Yeah, I can go.
And I'm reminded of the keynote presentation in Townsville a couple of years ago, which focused on racism and truth-telling, and the importance of setting the tone of the conference on that foundational principle, if you like, of truth-telling. And so thank you for us hearing your way of starting to tell some truth that we can build on. So thank you.
Thank you. Take a seat.
We might just have go to 10:15 if that's all right, and just there's a couple of key questions in the room. I don't want to push the program out for the whole day because the other things are going to be fantastic as well. But Luke, if you're all right for just 5 minutes of questions. And I think Robert has a question in the room, but I don't know where Robert is. I can't see. Thanks. Have we got a roving mic? Wow.
Hello. There we go. Ridiculous. Luke, we know each other. I'm Robert Blackley from Palm Island. Luke, we can't teach medical students everything about us in 4 to 6 year medical programs where there's limited time given to Indigenous health. So if you could distill for us what it is that students and doctors must know about us, what would that be?
That's a great question, and it's a practical reality that we do not have the time to instill thousands of years of history. Is there 750,000 of us in Australia of all our different experiences and collectives? So those fundamentally important things. What I love about our methodologies and our pedagogies is that they're best practice for everyone. And what is best practice in Aboriginal education is best practice. What is best practice in Indigenous health, Indigenous medical education is just best practice, because it doesn't say, here's an Aborigine and here's how you fix them. It says to work with Indigenous people, you need to know the individual, you need to know the cultural context, you need to have respect and develop a rapport, you need to have a human-centred approach, and you need to be willing to take on board what they're saying rather than you just as the expert offering the answers. And that is true for everyone. That is the instilling. But in terms of that history, and they need to know about social Darwinism. Like they really, so like all the cultures, it's so different when I'm sitting there going, I'm teaching teachers, and it's like, and if you go work in the Northern Territory, it's not going to be the same as if you work in here. If you go work in Tasmania, it's not going to be the same. And not just here, like I'm on the Central Coast. If you go to Sydney, it's different. If you go to Newcastle, it's different. We're talking on the way over here about that idea of travelling international, and it's like, we do that every day, because there's different nations everywhere we go. This is my first time here overseas, but I travel internationally all the time. And so we can't. You could never teach that. Even in a degree of Indigenous studies, you can't teach that. So you get back to those core principles of respect, of understanding that what has generally been regarded as best practice, historically regarded as best practice, is actually massively exclusionary practices, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for anyone who doesn't fit a very rigid mould of what is the ideal student, the ideal patient. And so that best practice approach, if people understand that, then they understand that the onus of responsibility is on them as the professional. You can't go, I can't help that person, they're a bad patient. I can't teach that kid, they're a bad student. The moment you have a professional framework that lets you think that about anyone, you are professionally negligent. You need to understand, the onus of responsibility is on you as the professional. I think if people walk away with that understanding, they can learn from experience, and the experiences they have, they will learn from, because they will engage in reflective practice, understanding those core principles.
And Andrea, would you mind asking the last question, and then we'll break for morning tea and the conversation can continue, I'm sure. But I can't see you either.
Thank you, Luke. I'm Andrea from Adelaide Uni. You mentioned that being the recipient of racism is more dangerous than being the perpetrator. What are your strategies to address racism or to advocate for anti-racism?
That's where I think in professional settings, it's getting back to that idea I said at the start, that anti-racism is a skill set, not a value. And so when we have, especially when it's non-Indigenous managers looking at a non-Indigenous person saying, well, they're not racist, they're really nice. It's like, that's not how that works. That's not what we're talking about. It's like at the moment, again, with one of those racist coppers down in Victoria, someone came out, a journalist came out and go, no, guys, he's a loving husband and father. It's like, I okay, like that has nothing to do with what we're talking about, because he's actually on video being racist. But yeah, if people don't have that understanding and know how to respond to it in professional ways. So again, we give responsibility to people who have no understanding of what racism is, and they're responsible for determining if racism was. And that, again, how does that work? That's bringing me into the clinic and going, what do you think, Luke? Does he have... I don't. No, he doesn't have cancer. He's a really nice guy. Like, I don't... That's... like, that's not what it is. So we've got to have... It's got to be clearly articulated. And it's got to be a skill set that is developed at that management executive level, and there's got to be a level of responsibility and accountability. When someone is racist, and particularly this is so common within the police force, we're putting them through a 3-day cultural awareness training program, and it's like, that's not how that works. Those 3-day programs are great for people who want to learn. For someone who doesn't think I'm human, it might take a little bit more than 3 days, is all I'm saying. So again, the processes have to match the stated outcome. And I think we're just light years away from that being a reality.
Thanks, Andrea. Look, can you, we are short of time. There's a bunch of questions, I'm sure. The conversation over the next 2 days can continue. Can you join me in thanking Luke for his really amazing keynote?